By the end of the 20th century, the world was increasingly dominated by American hegemony. Their old enemies lay broken before them. Their economic, political, and military might fell to the world over, and the world largely knew peace. Within the shadow of this American eagle, beneath this veneer of peace, tensions were on the rise. An emerging China seeking its own place in the sun began to impose its will on neighboring nations. Between them, an invisible empire grew, expanding amongst the disillusioned, the disenfranchised, and the forgotten, uniting these disparate peoples in their opposition to the dominance of the superpowers, opposing their meddling, of their exploitation, their immorality and imperialism, and from these desperate people they built a global liberation army. The earliest evidence of its existence, a string of terrorist attacks in the early 21st century, the damage they inflicted relatively minor on the global scale. These early actions only hinting at their growing power. Injected with funds from a number of wealthy backers, organizational cells spread across East Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East, growing across all strata of society, government officials, warlords, arms dealers, the desperate, and the dreamers. It was their ties to the underworld that gave their fledgling army access to military hardware. Resources were gathered from mothballed Soviet stockpiles and scavenged from far-flung battlefields. Their weapons and tactics of war were largely improvised, new tools being constructed to meet their changing needs. Chemical weapons, biotoxins, advanced camouflage patterns, GPS scramblers, and explosives. Even so, their firepower remained dwarfed by either great power, a deficiency they partly made up with resourcefulness, tactics, biochemicals, and fanaticism. The growing financial infrastructure allowed them to attract scientists who weren't constrained by ethics, to attract businesses that were willing to dabble in the illegitimate, and to fund mouthpieces to spread their vision and draw in recruits. The independent actions of individual cells made it difficult, if not impossible, for governments to fully stamp out or even identify GLA activity. By that same token, in those early years, cohesive actions were rare in the absence of a truly effective leader, leading to a highly fractured and factional organization built more on a web of alliances and deals than on any true hierarchy. Often only united in their calls to liberate the oppressed peoples of the world, independent cells pursued their own agendas, engaging in numerous independent actions, raiding refugee camps, stealing food supplies and foreign aid, bombing embassies, sinking naval vessels, and contributing to a general increase in militancy across Central Asia, each pursuing their endeavors with a fanatical zeal, largely unconcerned with collateral damage, and often seeing civilians as nothing more than sheep sympathetic to the imperialists. In 2013, the GLA rose to international attention when cells based in Aldistan and Kazakhstan raided Chinese military outposts, seizing war materials and destroying a nuclear power plant, their actions showering much of the surrounding region in radioactive fallout. Chinese efforts to secure the region played into propagandist hands. They were able to present China's actions as heavy-handed, intrusive, and brutish. In so doing, they built popular support for secession. Sensing an opportunity, a number of cells struck across the country, opening their new offensive with the detonation of a low-yield nuclear device in Beijing. Eventually, their efforts would stall as China devoted significant resources to hunting down and eliminating GLA cells hidden throughout their country. Some were destroyed, others retreated west. But even in their defeats, China suffered. The loss of Three Gorges Dam, the damage to Beijing and Hong Kong, toxins pouring across the Tibetan Plateau. Chinese forces, supported by American air power and satellite networks, invaded Aldistan, their forces meeting with strong resistance. GLA soldiers and civilians alike took up arms, and fighting devolved into thick urban combat, first at Bishkek and soon thereafter at Dushanbe. GLA forces rigged the city with IEDs and bomb trucks. Their forces in the nearby mountains unleashed swarms of Scud missiles, and China responded in turn with their nuclear arsenal. Fallout and anthrax dust covered the city, smothering any remaining life within. As China celebrated their victory, expanding their control over Aldistan and pushing on to neighboring Kazakhstan, the GLA survived in their shadow. Their forces, weakened by the conflict, began to rebuild. The victory had left Chinese forces stretched thin. Economic, military, and civilian targets alike were left lightly guarded, and GLA agents seized upon this, seizing supplies from UN convoys, making deals with local arms dealers, and rallied the populace against the Chinese occupation. In Astana, angry mobs stormed across the city, leaving a burning husk in their wake. With supplies and bodies, they struck out once more, striking a rapid blow to Chinese forces around Shymkent before moving further west. Moving quickly, their forces devastated American air power in Turkey, and along the Aral Sea they secured stockpiles of toxic materials, their forces growing powerful in these victories. Efforts by Chinese agents to persuade the ambitious and power-hungry among them to break with the GLA proved an utter failure. GLA agents learned of their efforts and purged the betraying cells from the organization. Pure of any dissent, the GLA stood united in their mission, turning their attention to Buccaneer Cosmodrome, an immense facility originally constructed to send cosmonauts into space. For the GLA, it would be a tool to carry their message to the world. Fighting grew increasingly harsh as both China and the United States increased their commitment to the region, deploying considerable forces and bringing their immense firepower to bear. In the face of nuclear weapons, particle cannons, and swarms of armor and infantry, the GLA emerged victorious. In the immediate aftermath of their victory, they launched an anthrax-filled ICBM, and in mere moments, countless lives were snuffed out. Across the world, many feared who would be their next target. In that fear, the world united against the GLA. American forces were fully committed to the conflict, and the GLA was forced to give ground, losing strongholds in Iraq, Yemen, and Kazakhstan, suffering defeats on nearly every front and their leadership being hunted to Astana, where, under constant bombardment, GLA forces proved unable to stem the combined Sino-American forces. Those that still held Buccaneer launched a biological weapon at American naval forces in northern Europe, only to be destroyed in the coming hours themselves. The loss of leadership and the defeat on the battlefield for a time broke the GLA as a united front, the vacuum tempting the more ambitious to seek power for themselves, while others weighed the benefit of global cooperation over their more local objectives. Over the coming days and weeks, the GLA began to coalesce around a new leader, General Muammar Deathstrike, a leader who would purge the GLA of its pretenders and prepared it for a new round of offensives. Weakened, the organization relied on stealth, turning their enemies' strengths against them, crippling America's Mediterranean fleet and striking where the Americans least expected them, their own backyard. And the aftermath of such operations led the United States to rethink its global commitments, with many advocating for a redeployment to the homeland. Seizing upon this weakness, GLA forces moved rapidly to secure America's positions in Europe. Their gains were short-lived as China, using its nuclear arsenal and mass numbers, crushed their forces in Europe. The remaining cells were hunted down and their surviving leaders placed on trial, with China vowing to take up the mantle of the war on terror. It may well seem that the GLA's days are numbered. Whether or not this proves to be the case, the ideas they propagated have proven to be much harder to stamp out, as the very conditions that gave rise to the GLA have endured, with many nations and many people simply trading one foreign oppressor for another.